Chapter 4. I fully expected to find a constable in the kitchen, waiting to take me up. But not only was there no constable there, but no discovery had yet been made of the robbery. Mrs. Joe was prodigiously busy in getting the house ready for the festivities of the day, and Joe had been put upon the kitchen doorstep to keep him out of the dustpan, an article into which his destiny always led him sooner or later when my sister was vigorously reaping the floors of her establishment. "And where the deuce have you been?" was Mrs. Joe's Christmas salutation when I and my conscience showed ourselves. I said I had been down to hear the carols. "Ah, well," observed Mrs. Joe, "you might have done worse." Not a doubt of that, I thought. Perhaps if I weren't a blacksmith's wife and, what's the same thing, a slave with her apron never off, I should have been down to hear the carols, said Mrs. Joe. I'm rather partial to carols myself, and that's the best of reasons for my never hearing any. Joe, who had ventured into the kitchen after me, as the dustpan had been retired before us, drew the back of his hand across his nose with a conciliatory air when Mrs. Joe darted a look at him, and, when her eyes were withdrawn, secretly crossed his two forefingers and exhibited them to me as our token that Mrs. Joe was in a cross temper. This was so much her normal state that Joe and I would often, for weeks together, be, as our fingers, like monumental crusaders as to their legs. We were to have a superb dinner consisting of a leg of pickled pork and greens and a pair of roast stuffed fowls. A handsome mince pie had been made yesterday morning, and which accounted for the mincemeat not being missed, and the pudding was already on the boil. These extensive arrangements occasioned us to be off unceremoniously in respect of breakfast. "For I an't," said Mrs. Joe, "I an't a-going to have no formal cramming and bursting and washing up now. What with I've got before me, I promise you. I an't a-going to have no formal cramming and bursting and washing up now, what with what I've got before me, I promise you." So we had our slices served out as if we were 2,000 troops on a forced march instead of a man and boy at home, and we took gulps of milk and water with apologetic countenances from a jug on the dresser. In the meantime, Mrs. Joe put clean white curtains up and tacked a new flowered flounce across the wide chimney to replace the old one, and uncovered the little state parlour across the passage, which was never uncovered at any other time, but passed the rest of the year in a cool haze of silver paper, which even extended to the 4 little white crockery poodles on the mantel shelf, each with a black nose and a basket of flowers in his mouth, and each the counterpart of the other. Mrs. Joe was a very clean housekeeper, but had an exquisite art of making her cleanliness more uncomfortable and unacceptable than dirt itself. Cleanliness is next to godliness, and some people do the same by their religion. Cleanliness is next to godliness, and some people do the same by their religion. My sister, having so much to do, was going to church vicariously. That is to say, Joe and I were going. In his working clothes, Joe was a well-knit, characteristic-looking blacksmith. In his holiday clothes, he was more like a scarecrow in good circumstances than anything else. Nothing that he wore then fitted him or seemed to belong to him, and everything that he wore then grazed him. On the present festive occasion, he emerged from his room, when the blithe bells were going, the picture of misery, in a full suit of Sunday penitentials. As to me, I think my sister must have had some general idea that I was a young offender whom an Acacia policeman had taken up on my birthday and delivered over to her to be dealt with according to the outraged majesty of the law. I was always treated as if I had insisted on being born, in, in opposition to the dictates of reason, religion and morality, and against the dissuading arguments of my best friends. I was always treated as if I had been. I was always treated as if I had insisted on being born in opposition to the dictates of reason, religion and morality, and against the dissuading arguments of my best friends. Even when I was taken to have a new suit of clothes, the tailor had orders to make them like a kind of reformatory, and on no account to let me have the free use of my limbs. Joe and I going to church, therefore, must have been a moving spectacle for compassionate minds. Yet, what I suffered outside was nothing to what I underwent within. The terrors that had assailed me whenever Mrs. Joe had gone near the pantry or out of the room were only to be equalled by the remorse with which my mind dealt on what my hands had done. Under the weight of my wicked secret, I pondered whether the church would be powerful enough to shield me from the vengeance of the terrible young man if I divulged to that whether the church would be powerful enough to shield me from the vengeance of the terrible young man if I divulged to that establishment.